Hello, guys. I hear my chicken's about to croak out there, it sounds like. But how you guys doing? David Vose here. Another beautiful day. Some kind of rain clouds up ahead, up above, up above. But no rain yet. Just a sprinkle yesterday. But we've been getting clouds. And it's about time. Summer starts coming around and we get these clouds every day and it rains a little bit every day. Such wonderful weather in the summer here. Man, oh man, I love it. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Well, friends, we're going to get into another video on talking about more about all of our questions. Don't you got some questions? I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of questions. And the more we dig into this, it probably opens up even more questions. And I got some more questions too. So I've been asking AI and I've been asking the Lord. Now, the Lord gives me the answers. AI just gives me, shows if there's any evidence or documentation for those answers. But sometimes they give me clues and a little rabbit hole to go down. And it's certainly a useful tool. And so I want to dig deep today. I want to, I'm not always about facts. Oh, facts are important. Facts. Yeah, I'm all about facts. We need facts. But more than facts, oh boy, you can hear the thunder. Maybe it is going to rain. Or is that a... Yeah. Oh, listen to the thunder. Okay. Well, yeah, I love facts. Okay, but what I'm saying is, and don't get me wrong, I love facts. But more than facts is I want to understand. Because there's a lot of facts flying around everywhere. But very few people understand anything. It's like there's holes in everything. And we can't get the puzzle back. This Rubik's Cube seems to have like 1,000 sides and 1,000 cubes on each side. And it's really hard to solve this. But we're making progress. Good progress. We're starting to understand some things about what's going on here. And so I want to trace back what these knights were doing, why there were so many of these societies in the world, and so many of them were here in America and doing all kind of shenanigans. Good people, bad people, assassinations, wars, religious people doing religious things, and prophets and economies and constitutions, and what does it all mean? Really? Was all this planned, or what's going on? There's a secret behind a lot of things that most people aren't aware of, but some of the elite are. I want to trace the Masons back and understand fully and completely where they came from, why they're coming from that place, and what they're talking about, and why it's all secret, and what may have happened here in America in the first 50, 100 years, and what they're planning on doing. So let's get right into it today. Again, we're going to have to do some research and read a little bit of here and there. But the stuff that we're going to be sharing with you today is priceless, friends. I know it's a little difficult to wade through a whole hour of this historical stuff, but we got to get through this because we got to absolutely establish what's going on here. So let's start here. Let's start right off with this. We talked about a man named Jonas, Grand Master Jonas. His name was Abraham Jonas, Jewish, who was the Grand Master of Illinois and Kentucky, who was starting all these lodges and seemed to have some kind of authority, was from England, came over to America, didn't identify as Christian, he identified as Jewish, but he joined the Masons, and I guess he learned what that was all about and learned their secrets, and wasn't really Jewish anymore per se, but he had some added knowledge, some esoteric understanding. I know Joseph Smith talked a lot about learning from these old rabbis. Well, This must have been one of the rabbis he'd learned from. And evidently this was his teacher in many ways, although Joseph was directly inspired of deity and had revelations, as a prophet does. But I want to know, who is this Abraham Jonas? And why was he and some other Jewish individuals like Moses Levy and Judah Benjamin running the Confederate Army and KGC and initiating Joseph Smith into some priesthood? And these very people, Washington, Lincoln, all of these guys were Masons. They claim Lincoln wasn't, but in fact, it was a very big thing back in the day. Lincoln was always telling people, I don't know anything about this. He said he loved the Masons. He respected them highly, but he never wanted to join because he was too lazy to go to all their meetings. That's what he said. But I guarantee that he never would have gotten elected had he not been in alignment with some authority, with some tradition that was at that time agreeable to all, but yet disagreeable to certain ones that, I guess, murdered him or whatever was going on there. So let's dig deep and see what we can find about this Abraham Jonas. Jonas Abraham, biography, 1801 to the 8th of June, 1864. Auctioneer, merchant, newspaper publisher, lawyer, born in Exeter, Devonshire, England. Son of Benjamin Jonas and Annie Ezekiel. Jewish. Immigrated to U.S., settled in Cincinnati, 1819. Married first Lucy Ora Seixas? I wonder what that means. Before 1825, probably in Cincinnati, moved to Williamstown, Grant County, Kentucky, which is where all these people were. Served in Kentucky legislature. Married second, Louisa Block, Grand Master of Grand Masonic Lodge of Kentucky, 1833 to 1834. Moved to Columbus, Adams County, Illinois, 1836. Moved to Quincy, Adams County, 1834. Founded the newspaper Columbus Advocate in 1840. Organized Second Grand Masonic Lodge of Illinois, 1840. So he's the one organizing the lodges and getting them going. He served as Grand Master in 1840 to 1842 in the one in Illinois. Instrumental in establishment of Masonic Lodge in Nauvoo, Hancock County, Illinois, and advancement of Joseph Smith in Masonry, 1842. Served in Illinois legislature. Served in the Illinois legislature in 1842 through 1844. Died in Quincy. Yeah, Quincy's not very far. And I've been to Quincy, too. There's a lot of really neat bridges across those rivers in that area. But I don't know if that's the kind of country I like, because it seems a bit humid, and there's probably a lot of bugs and stuff in that area. But it could be turned into a paradise. There's certainly a lot of green and trees. And I bet that was a beautiful place when they were going out that way and clearing the land. And I know when they first went over the Mississippi River, it was like 1839. Joseph Smith had just gotten out of prison in Missouri or something, and they were buying lands in Commerce, which was on the other side of the Mississippi River. And they had to travel like 50 miles, and they were getting eaten up by mosquitoes, and a lot of people got malaria. Thousands of people were lying along the river just in cots and stuff. They'd all had malaria crossing the Mississippi. There must have been a lot of mosquitoes and swamplands in that area and stuff. I mean, Missouri is, known for pretty harsh, ticks and mosquitoes and things. I can vouch for that when I was over there in Oklahoma, not far from there. But there was a man that actually ended up dying. His name was Elijah, interestingly enough. Elijah Fordham. And Joseph Smith raised him from the dead. He'd been dead 4 days. But there was this one point when they were crossing the Mississippi River, on their way to commerce or something. Um, Everybody was had some kind of disease. I think it was malaria or something, and there were people dying. One of which they buried, wrapped him in gauze. He was green. He stunk. He'd been dead 4 days. And Joseph Smith stood and said, "Elijah, I command you in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, rise up and be made whole." Something like that. And do you know, very few people really even know this, but this is one of the very few. I don't know if there are any other instances other than the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But I don't believe there is any other person that it has been documented raised somebody from the dead. 4 days dead. Stunk, was gangrene. This is documented by many affidavits that were there that day. It's written down in historical records. It's really hard to deny that this did not happen. With this, everybody that was there was a lot of people there. They signed affidavits where this was all witnessed by many people, just like in biblical times, when 500 people witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, and people saw different miracles. There were witnesses to it. That's why we've got scripture there, testimony. So there were testimonies written that Joseph Smith said in a loud voice that sounded like an angel. Now, I know everybody said that. Now, I know sometimes people say, oh, his voice was like an angel, and they're just being poetic, but this was something that everybody said. He had some strange, like, annunciation, and he said, in the name of Jesus, you will stand up. But it was a big kind of uh, theatrical spectacle that everybody witnessed. And this dead man that had been dead and was stinking and turned gangrene, he said, get up and walk. And the man started moving. They unwrapped all the gauze and pulled it off of him. He was gangrene and stunk, and he walked out of there. And everybody saw it. And I think it was either before or after that, shortly before or after that, he went back to the bank of the river where all these people were laying in cots and blankets along the river, dying. Somewhere between, I don't know, there's like a couple of thousand people that were just in critical, serious condition. And they said that Joseph Smith went from one person to the next person, wrist infection or whatever, and he was sitting there praying and holding these people. And he healed, I think, something like 2,000 people that day. And this is all written down in affidavits. But I want to know, today when you are being told by one of these Mormon missionaries or something about these stories, they don't tell you the culture that was going on in the United States at that time. A lot of people are always talking about, well, isn't the Mormon church just another, it's just masonry, right? It's just the same exact Masonic rites. Well, absolutely. Not just similar, but it's the same rites tweaked a little bit. And you say, well, okay, so he made it up and he just stole it from the. No, they don't steal it. He was initiated by a master mason that was initiated by a greater master mason. They were sent to this area for this reason, to build the New Jerusalem. It was a Masonic Templar goal when they got to America. George Washington and all of them had the same goal. Joseph Smith was going to run for president, and he probably would have become president had he lived, but they murdered him, and that was one of the reasons why. But it wasn't just because he was going to become president, because he was the good guy saying, no, we're not going to have slaves. No, we're not going to murder one another. No, we're not going to have spies and running around, and you're in apostasy. But he didn't deny the lineal descent of these priests. Although at one point, after he died, Brigham Young came up with all this stuff about how the church had to be restored. Because you see, that's why I thought that it would be important. I mean, I don't even believe necessarily in baptism at this time. Because if there was such a thing as baptism, certainly would be necessary, as Jesus was baptized by John, to have someone in authority to do that. I mean, I'm not sure that I would just go out by myself somewhere, dip in a stream or a lake and say, hey, I'm baptized now. If you want to do that, sometimes symbolic things, we can dedicate ourselves to the Lord. The Lord hears us. And that's really what's important. But rituals and ceremonies are not really the important thing. They're symbolic. They're types and shadows. So the priesthood that was restored was not so much, hey, we got a building now with the proper gargoyle on the front. And we got handshakes and secret rituals or, baptisms and all this. That's not what Christianity is about. And Joseph Smith said as much. But it is important to have regular gatherings and meetings and through symbolism teach your flock. You can use symbolism to teach them, and baptism has always been used as a symbol to teach about how we are incarnated in the world. We go down under and we don't come back up until we've died and rose again. But so for me, when I was young, now at this point, I'm content to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit. It's me and the Lord here. But, there are certain things that need to be authorized. I mean, you can't just say, hey, I'm going to rule over you people. I said so. You got to have duly organized a vote or people need to recognize the fact that you might be a wise man. And they point you out. You don't point out yourself. So I understand all of that. But when I was a young man, I was learning about this. The Lord told me that Joseph Smith was a prophet. But I never became a Mormon. But I did seek out information and prayed a lot about it to find out if I should be a Mormon. And I ended up going to Salt Lake City to check it out and to find out. I went on a trip and was praying. And the Lord led me to this hill that was above the rest of the city somewhere. I don't remember where it was, the address or anything. But I was traveling around wondering, where am I going to go? Because I need to go talk to somebody and I want to investigate. Well, the Lord led me to this kind of a magical city on a hill. It was this little hill, was like a garden. And on top of this hill was this beautiful church. It looked like a temple. And as I remember it, it was kind of like pink. It looked pink and had glass, a lot of glass. And I pulled in thinking, well, this must be a Mormon church. And I looked around and it was not a Mormon church. It was the reorganized Mormon church. And so I just parked my vehicle and went in and sat down. And I learned something. It was so amazing. These people were so humble. And remember, I was there on a religious quest asking the Lord what to do. And I go in there, and that day, we sat in a circle. There was no service like normal churches where some pastor's up there going, you will repent and blah, 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 blah. It wasn't anything like normal church. It was just, we're all sitting around in a circle talking, and they included me, and they were so wonderful. And what they were talking about is that what really is prophets and what really is prophecy. They believed that Joseph Smith was a prophet, but they said, okay, but what is it? Could you be a prophet? Could you be a prophet? This is the restoration. And that if a man gets a revelation from the Lord, well, he's not going to get it perfect. It's based on what he now can understand or bring back to the world. And then how can he relate that to others, and how will they interpret it? So you go through a lot of different, it's like, the two cans on the end of a string, and somebody says, hey, tomatoes. And at the other end, they hear potatoes. And then they tell everybody, he said potatoes. And they think he said, let's go play with some Legos. So the divine truth can only be known by each of us individually. The Holy Spirit will teach us. We need no man to teach us, but she will teach us everything we ought to know. And in the hour we need to know it, we will learn from our divine mother. But there are men that can help us, and they can use dramas and teachings and symbols. And the prophets left us words and parables that they're like mantras that to help us understand, to go to the Lord, to tell us which way to go. And then we can go and find out for ourselves. But I listened very carefully, and I was like, okay, I got my message. The Lord said, look, yeah, I want you to study what Joseph Smith taught. I want you to study what other prophets taught. But don't get all sidetracked by thinking that there is some, man that you've got to go to, or some building, some holy building that you need to be baptized in, or whether or not you need to be baptized at all. So just to be sure, I don't know, it was a little sometime later, when I went back to where I was in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, there was a reorganized Mormon church there. And I actually went out there, and it was actually on this big lake, Lake Coeur d'Alene. Actually, I think it was maybe a little further out on a little cove of that lake. And I went there and said, hey, I want to get baptized by somebody who has the authority from Joseph Smith, just because I feel that's appropriate. Because he did have the Holy Spirit. I do believe that, and the Lord told me that. And I'm expecting them to like take me to a temple, and no, they go, no, we don't do that. We go out to the lake like John baptized Jesus. So we got a lake right here, Lake Coeur d'Alene, and I went to Lake Coeur d'Alene, was baptized in Idaho in the lake. So yeah, I was baptized by Jehovah's Witnesses. Wish I had never done that, because that was not a good thing. They just want you to be a member of their church, right? And then once you do that, then they can disfellowship you. See, you make agreements. I didn't make an agreement with anybody. This was just between me and the Lord. And it was just a personal thing that I wanted to do. Have a new start. But I wanted to do it in an actual lake by those who also had been baptized by people that understood these things. And I thought that this group of people was probably about the best you could find on earth. Although I'm not a reorganized Mormon or a regular Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or an Adventist or any church, I don't belong to any church, but the true Church of Jesus Christ. And that's how I did it. But the restoration that Joseph Smith was talking about wasn't so much that, because remember, there's a lot of stuff that we hear from the Mormons that wasn't necessarily the way it was being taught by Joseph Smith. They've even changed a little bit of the wording of how he met the Lord and the things that he did. He was only like 15 years old when he first saw the angel. He was getting the golden plates and he began to translate and stuff. But I'm going to show you the actual, remember when we go to Moses, most Christians think he started a priesthood, that Yahweh came down on a mountain and says, okay, Moses, I've chosen you and you're going to be the first priest. He wasn't the first priest. He was a priest under the tutelage of Jethro, otherwise called Ruel, depending on whether you're looking at it from the point of view of a priesthood of the Melchizedek sort, which his name was Ruel, but as an appendage to that priesthood that they created, he became Yahthro, from Yahweh. But his daughter married Moses, and Moses' sister was also of the Melchizedek priesthood and lived in Bethlehem, and from that point forward, all the kings and the prophets and the anointed ones were born in that town from the descent of Mary, or Miriam, the sister of Moses. So the priesthood that was before Moses, before Miriam, goes back through this line in Bethlehem that were king priests. They were Nazarene priests, and they all had long hair, just like Samson. He never cut his hair. What's interesting about that is that the Knights of St. John, who, now remember, they're called the Knights of John the Elder, which would have been John the Baptist. And John the Baptist was a priest of the Nazarite sort, going back all the way, just like all the other priests that had this priesthood, they had long hair. So King David must have had long hair. Jesus must have had long hair. Perhaps, maybe Jesus came and said, hey, we don't have to do all these rituals and this, it's not what the priesthood's about. I don't know what Jesus told them or how long his hair was, but I know that he came eating and drinking. What does that mean? Well, John came not eating and not drinking. In other words, John was a Nazarite priest for sure. Jesus was very liberal in interpreting these customs and traditions, but Jesus indeed was the Nazarene. So the long hair was something that was the sign that they were of this order, which really is the Melchizedek priesthood, or the Zadokite priesthood. So the Merovingian line of kings that came and stems through the Mary Magdalene or the Knights of St. John, they were known for their long hair. They never cut their hair. You see in a lot of the legends originally from France and up into Europe as it moved up in that way when they were being driven out. But you always see the prince with long hair pulling the sword out of the rock. It is a distinct symbol that they were absolutely trying to display in all of the legends and the history that we have. We know that the Merovingian line, or the line of Mary Magdalene, or the line of St. John, or so forth, were Nazarite priests. And so St. Bernard de Clairvaux, or of the Clear Valley, who was of the lineal descent of the people of the valley, like Peter Waldo, or the Waldensians, which means is the valley people, and the Alps people, or the Albigenses. These were all people descended of Mary Magdalene, and every town and city was named after something. The central Avalon, the great castle, the knights, the princesses, all the cities had to do with these traditions. But I say all that with this in mind. So people look at Joseph Smith and they say, well, he comes along, who does he think he is, right? He don't have no authority to do what he's doing. Well, actually, there was a man who did have some kind of authority that initiated Joseph Smith. There was a chain of succession, just like Jethro to Moses. So we have Abraham Jonas, definitively from Europe, but Jewish, who had some kind of priesthood. Now, what kind of priesthood do these Jews have? That they could, in the latter days, lay their hands upon a man named Joseph Smith and claim now to be the continuation of this true priesthood. So who was this man, Abraham Jonas? Who was this Judah Benjamin that was down in Florida, or Moses Livet? Who were all these Judeans that were kind of secretly behind the scenes here in America, establishing 13 colonies? like the Union Jack, Jacob. And trying to create a new Jerusalem. Well, that's what we're going to get into here today, friends. So stay tuned. Buckle up. This will be the ride of your life because the destination is truth. And that's the most glorious place to be. I guarantee it. So let's find out who this Abraham Jonas really was. Links. Authorization from Abraham Jonas. Notice that it was on the Ides of March 15th, 1842, that Joseph Smith was initiated. Like when Jesus was baptized, it was like at this particular time. When Julius Caesar was murdered, it was the Ides of March. It's a very important date in the traditions of these ancient esoteric believers. But let's take a look at this. Here it is, March 15th, 5842, city of Nauvoo. I wonder if that was the date, the actual Jewish system of dating, that's 5842. I bet you that is. Know all ye brethren to whom come these presents, that I, Abraham Jonas, Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the state of Illinois, in virtue of the power and authority in me. Does that sound familiar? By virtue of the power and the authority invested in me. That's what some kind of like a pastor does when they marry somebody, by the power invested in me, So this is a legal proceeding, regardless of whether some of you people think that, it's all pagan or you don't like it because you belong to some church that says this is all evil. Well, where did your church come from? They were, all the Protestant churches have to be ordained ministers. To be an ordained minister, you had to have been ordained or been initiated. And the people that initiated you were these people. It's based on this wording, all these documentations and marriage licenses and you got to get your authority from somebody. Well, here is official authorization by someone who apparently has some kind of authority, because he was authorizing the initiation of all these different lodges, which is the true government behind the government of the United States. We're running around voting and doing all this legislature and all this commercialism and propaganda, and people says, oh, that's our governor and that's our senator, and we think all this is all that's going on. All of this is just a show. That's not even the government. The people in power are the ones who you never know their name. Most of you never heard of Abraham Jonas. Never heard of him. And yet he's the authority behind the entire Mormon church. And guess what? He's also the authority behind all the literal government authority. It was these individuals that were establishing people and constitutions and state democracies. They had the power and authority to join two people in marriage or to establish a lodge, which was what? It was the elder brethren who were the ones in authority appointing these individuals, and then they run them out in a show, in a theatrical show for us, and parade them around and say, which one do you like? Oh, this is Lincoln. Oh, and this is Jefferson Davis. They look identical, right? It don't matter which one you choose, but we're going to have two sides, so we always have, Democrat, Republican, communist, capitalist. There's always got to be, two sides to everything. And you guys can sit there and pretend that you're voting and you're deciding your own future. No. We are a theocracy. We always have been. Go read Plato's Republic. It's where it all started, with the Athenian temple on the hill. He said, look, we're going to have this system where kind of like aristocrats. It's certain individuals that are of certain bloodlines, and they're educated in the universities, and they've gone through the authority on earth, which is the scepter and the priesthood, the Levites. And if you're not one of these Levites, or of some order or chain of succession, then you are not an authorized priest. So, other than Jewish authorization, where would you get your authorization? You'd have to get it from not actually Jews. They don't have any authority. The Sanhedrin was gone by 70 AD. There was no more authority. There was no more Sanhedrin. Right? The Jewish temple was destroyed in 70, and there was no more Jewish government or Sanhedrin. It's over. But hold on. Jesus came to the world. He said, your house is left unto you desolate. He chose 12 and 72 also, which the book of Acts tells us the 72 were the elders. And we know that it's a Sanhedrin. That's what you do when you want a government. If you're of the line of the Lord and you're going to set up a government, it has to be a Sanhedrin. I mean, this principle's in every nation. They have senates. And the senates were very much like the Sanhedrins, and they were based on the same basic spiritual principle that goes back in every nation back to Noah and on the prophets. But if you're going to have a government, you got to have a Sanhedrin. Jesus chose the Sanhedrin, and the history books say the Sanhedrin went with Mary to Marseille, France, and there was his kingdom established. And the only authority that ever was on this earth after 70 AD was there in Marseille, France, or when it was taken to Montpellier, or later on to wherever they went, because they were persecuted and ran out, and they were intending to come to America and establish a New Jerusalem, meaning a Sanhedrin or a government. And they were doing so. And Joseph Smith was the recipient of that command from our Lord Jesus Christ and the scriptures themselves. So what gave Abraham Jonas any kind of authority? Well, he was a Sephardic Jew. And he came from originally in Spain and France, and this is the line of Jesus Christ and St. John, the elder. They were knighted. Jesus was the one who first knighted John on the cross. As he died, he knighted him. It says, see, there's your mother. Mother, there's your son. Take care of her and never let her out of your sight. You are the protector of the Holy Grail, the Holy Blood, the Holy Scriptures, the Holy Textus Receptus, and you better go bring the kingdom of my Father in heaven down to earth and establish it based upon these laws that I will give you, to love one another. Go point out the elders. Continue the priesthood. And remember that the priesthood is a priesthood of love and brotherhood. But as time went on, they began to get more secret. They murdered the apostles and the elders. And there was apostasy. Some of it went back to the old law. They went back to the vomit like a dog, Jesus said. The apostasy set in. But there was one lineal descendants. The Merovingian line came down. They built this in this Sacramenia in Segovia, Spain. They built a holy temple, performed holy initiation rites to knight other knights. They came over in explorations to find the king's land, to build the king's temple in the service of Jesus, their Lord and Savior, and their ancient princess and mother, Mary Magdalene. Yeah, they were Jewish, but they were Christian. And this authority that they had was divine authority from Jesus Christ. And so Joseph Smith was divinely initiated into the divine priesthood. But let's find out a little bit more about who this Abraham Jonas was and this whole organization that is the authority behind the United States government. Now, remember, if all these people from Our Lady Mary and Saint Bernard de Clairvaux and from the lineage of Pierre Valdez Percival of the line of the princes back to King Arthur at the Round Table that goes back to Mary Magdalene and the Knights of St. John. There is definitely stories and historical evidence everywhere. It's just nobody's ever put this together. They went east through, like Afghanistan, through Persia, through China, all the way to Japan, and created and preached Christ and established this same divine priesthood all the way there. This is why we've got law and order all over the world. But at times it went a little bit more back to the law of Moses, and there were others who would preach the grace and they would return to Christ and they'd all be baptized. But then there were those who wanted to follow after the law of Moses, and they began to have wars. And so the ones who were following the law of Moses were massacring, genociding, and Prester John, with all the remnant of the tribes of Israel that went with him, eventually went to Africa. This is why the oldest Bibles, the Ethiopian version, they were down there in Ethiopia. And they were there for a long time, establishing the church. And then they were eventually driven out of Spain, which was run by these individuals, the Moors and so forth. And of course, this is why they had their alliance with the Languedoc, the Septimania in southern France on the border of Spain with the Moors. They had this alliance because they were brothers, all from the same ancient priesthood back to Christ. They knew exactly what they were doing. But they were driven out of France, and then driven out of Spain, and driven out of Africa, and driven out of Scotland, where they went, and the Isles of Man, and Wales, and Britain, and they all came to America. And here come these individuals like Abraham Jonas, Judah Benjamin, and Moses Leavitt, who was behind the establishment of these governmental agencies, and seemed to think they had authority in the sense that they were initiating all of our founders. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson Davis, whether you're on this side or the Confederate or the Union or whatever, they were all initiated and authorized by the same priesthood. Sephardic Judaism? No. Descendants of Mary Magdalene, they all spoke of it openly. Well, was there a need for an absolute restoration? Yes, because what Joseph Smith was given was, after being duly initiated by the appropriate authority, he then was given, it was conferred upon him, what the Lord wanted him to restore to the world. Because of what Joseph Smith did just before he died, 1844, when he sent people over to Israel and had them start praying for the restoration. And from that moment on, we started digging up the Sumerian tablets and all this ancient writings, which is the restoration of the truth of these peoples that are the lost tribes of Israel. And we began to see immediately the holy people. Most of them were the real Jewish people, Israelite people, not necessarily Jewish, from all around the world start going back to the Palestine area, especially since 1917 with the Balfour Declaration that made a mandate for them to return. And then, of course, after World War II, then they became a nation. But that's turned into some diabolic thing that people don't understand, just like they don't understand what we're talking about here with the authority of government and what a priesthood is. But why do people say, oh, Joseph Smith made it up? Well, it's documented. He was initiated. Do you think this guy that initiated Joseph Smith was like, hey, I didn't tell you to go start, some cult? What do you got, 12 apostles there, Joseph? Who you think you are? It's probably a little bit like Jethro, who's like, okay, who's this kid Moses? I'll let him marry my daughter, and now all of a sudden Moses is the boss? Well, Moses threw down his staff, and it turned into a serpent and ate up Jethro's staff. And Jethro knew that because he was one of the high priests that was down there serving as a counselor to the Pharaoh. And he also had the priesthood and threw down his staff. The fact that Moses' serpent ate up his just meant that the divine authority was going to be in the hands of Moses. And Jethro had to accept it. And I imagine that Abraham Jonas, even though he had the authority and initiated Joseph Smith, I imagine he did not deny, or he would have written things right after saying, what the heck is this Joseph Smith doing? I didn't authorize this. Well, it must have been authorized. And so there must have been many within the Masonic order at that time that were good people, and this was their goal, and they saw the inspiration and the hand of deity upon Joseph Smith. And that's why so many thousands of people coming from Europe to see the great prophet in America. That's why they were following him all the way to far west Missouri, which back in those days meant, because Missouri was a territory, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Illinois, Nauvoo, Illinois became the largest city in the West, bigger than Chicago or anywhere else. All because they were following some young man who claimed to be a prophet, who they saw raise the dead, and prophesied the exact date and time and everything that went on with the Civil War and every other thing you can imagine that was going on in those days. Joseph Smith probably had a prophecy about it. And guarantee it wasn't so ambiguous like Nostradamus, but it was very clear and specific. And all of the things Joseph Smith said came true. Even though he didn't like Brigham Young, he said that they would follow that man to hell all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and they'd become a great and mighty people. But that they would have to learn some lessons before Christ came back, that they would apostatize. He prophesied all of this, and certainly denied ever being a polygamist, and forbade it. And this is one of the big reasons why they murdered him. But it wasn't just that. Is that they saw that he had this power. And so, just like the Judas Iscariot, the betrayal, just like there's always been corruption, well, it wasn't time, I guess, for the world to enter into the kingdom. So there was some more weeding in the garden that needed to be done. And a time of decisions and a period of sifting like wheat, because the world was going to have to go all the way down to the great time of the great judgment. But let's take a little look about this man to see who he might have been. So then, if we go down here, well, this is actually a different page that I'm going to be reading it from at this point. I've switched to a different page, but it's the same thing we were reading before. We go down here where it says, the said lodge is authorized to confer the 3 several degrees of ancient York Masonry on the said Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. And see, that's as high as there is, this 3 degrees. All these other degrees were made up later, probably actually after Joseph Smith died, because Albert Pike was making all this up, these other 33 degrees about this time. As speedily as the nature of the case will admit, provided, however, that nothing herein contained shall be deemed as authority by the said Nauvoo Lodge for violating any of the ancient landmarks of the order, or by acting contrary to the provisions of their bylaws, except in the cases herein authorized, given under my hand as Grand Master the day and date above named. So who was Jonas, the father of Freemasonry in Illinois? Certainly looks Jewish. Of the many achievements he might have had inscribed on the granite monument over his grave in Quincy Valley of Peace Cemetery, Abraham Jonas sought to be remembered for only one. Abraham Jonas, first Grand Master of Masons of Illinois, 1840 to 1841. I don't want to read it all here, but just skipping down here to this next paragraph here. Lieutenant Colonel George Rogers Clark was the first documented Freemason in the environs of the mid-Mississippi that would become Illinois. On July 4th, 1778, Clark and 175 Virginia militiamen during the American Revolution routed the British and the Native Americans from the French settlement at Kaskaskia. Before he left, Clark inspired an interest in Freemasonry, and Kaskaskians in 1806 formed the territory's first Masonic organization. The Western Star Lodge, Illinois' first Grand Lodge, the governing body of a Masonic jurisdiction. That's another interesting thing. The Jehovah's Witnesses call their leaders governing body. Well, that phrase comes from Masonic law. They call their governing body that in their lodges. And they have jurisdiction. They have regions and districts, just like, because it's all about the law, and this is the authorization that they have, because it's the legal things that these things are legal words because it's government, and it stems from the authority of the Masons, and this is what the witnesses have today with their governing body and jurisdiction and districts and regional conventions and all of these things. So they formed the territory's first Masonic organization, the Western Star Lodge. Now there's an interesting thing. Remember the Lone Star, which is in the south? Well, here they're talking about the Western Star Lodge. So wherever you go, whatever you're talking about, or any organization that pops up, these little words and phrases all stem from the same legal talk. So they had a lot of talk about certain stars, and this meant something to them. So this was the Western Star Lodge. Illinois, first Grand Lodge, the governing body of a Masonic jurisdiction. So I wonder if the Lone Star meant people that were kind of living down in places like Florida or Cuba or Texas, which would be the southern area. And up in Illinois, they called it the Western Star. So that's a kind of a clue as to what all this is talking about. Masonic jurisdiction was created in Vandalia in 1822. Shadrach Bond, the state's first governor, was the lodge's Grand Master. So you see, if you want to become a governor, a senator, an attorney, somebody important, you have to join the lodge, because this is the authority. They do not give these positions of authority out. They don't allow them to anyone who is not under oath. This is something that us peasants don't realize. People are born, they're like, I want to grow up to be a football player. I want to be a doctor. You can't choose what you want unless your parents know that and early on they get you in one of these organizations, start running you through the ranks and raising you up so that you go up through the ranks and get your little gold star. You know how when you go through contests, you get these little trophies, and a lot of times they'll pin a ribbon on you? Well, if you look at that original coin or seal, and a lot of them are this way, there's a star in the middle of the round coin, and then there are usually 4 ribbons going out. And those ribbons are like on the flag. They're beams of light is what those ribbons are. Red, white, and blue. Well, the black or the dark blue is the sky and the stars are white. And then there's these red stripes, which is the sun's bright shining, right? This is the dawn's early shining. And so the ribbon is a ray of light, but it's always connected to a star, a golden star. And when you get one, then you get the next ribbon or advancement. And that's what this is all about. The whole world is run by this, good or bad. And I tell you that the entire world, the government of this world, was initiated and has and the only authority our government has is from Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. That's it. All government, whether it's in Russia, China, Christian or non-Christian nations, they're under the authority of Jesus Christ, and they are stewards of Christ, and they're either faithful to Jesus or they're unfaithful to him. And even if the whole town is apostate and corrupt, they know it's illegal, they know it's wrong. And even if they've made up all kind of new laws, like the Pharisees, right? Making an offense about the law. Not even understanding that we're not really even under law, we're under grace. But they perverted it. And of course, you have people that rise up, like Joseph Smith, who knows this and is saying, no, we have to reform this, and we have to, you haven't lost your authority, you've just lost your mind. You're an unfaithful steward. So we need teachers, loving teachers. From its beginning in the early 18th century, Freemasonry had powerful foes, including former President John Quincy Adams. Opposed mainly to its secret ceremonies and rituals, the kidnapping and suspected murder of ex-Mason William Morgan of Batavia, New York in 1826 so disturbed public sensitivities that a national political party, the Anti-Masonic Party, formed. Morgan had threatened to reveal Masonic secrets. Publisher Turlough Weed's New York Tribune circulated nationally and led the anti-Masonic movement in the United States. Americans believed Masons had kidnapped and killed Morgan, who was never seen again. With Weed's support, the anti-Masonic Party achieved enough national prominence to run a presidential candidate in 1832. Former Freemason William Wirt of Baltimore, both of Wirt's opponents, President Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay of Kentucky, were Masons, however, and Jackson's re-election ultimately ended opposition to Freemasonry. Jonas, this Abraham Jonas, was 18 years old when he left his parents and 20 siblings in Portsmouth, England in 1819 to join his older brother Joseph, the first Jewish settler in Cincinnati. There, the Jonas brothers, does that sound familiar? The Jonas brothers organized a small community of Jews to establish a congregation and a B'nai Israel, the oldest synagogue west of the Alleghenies. In Cincinnati, the younger Jonas became acquainted with a group of men whose bond was Freemasonry. Although he had found some doors closed to Jews in Cincinnati, Jonas found no discrimination among his Freemason friends and joined their lodge. When, in 1825, he lost his wife, Lucy Ora Sexius, and shortly afterward their newborn son, Jonas moved 40 miles south to Williamstown, Kentucky. There he opened a store, married Lucy Block in 1829, fathered 5 children, and founded a Masonic lodge. Within 6 years, Jonas led Freemasonry in Kentucky, elected and serving as Grand Master from 1832 to 1838. It was in that role that he became acquainted with Quincy. With the anti-Masonic movement behind them, a group of Quincy men petitioned the Grand Lodge of Kentucky to charter a lodge under Jonas' administration of Kentucky Freemasonry. Bodley, Masonic Lodge number 97 of Quincy, was the first lodge chartered in Illinois on August 31st, 1836. Bodley was named for Thomas Bodley, a past Grand Master of the Kentucky Grand Lodge. Among Bodley's lodges after charter members were lawyer Henry Absury, grocer and wholesaler Michael Mast, meat packer Nathaniel Peace, Doctors Joseph N. Ralston and Hiram and Samuel Rogers. City and county founder John Wood and his father-in-law Joshua Streeter, a former justice of the peace, and a federal land agent Richard M. Young. See, all the judges and the people in authority in this country do have authority, except for the fact that they're all in some apostasy to the priesthood that they hold. They know that what they've done is keep these truths secret and keep lying to the public. The entire priesthood was in apostasy, but it still had the authority. So when Joseph Smith was initiated, he made an attempt to restore the virtues of these authorities. But they didn't like it and they killed him. They didn't want to restore it. See, they're not going to give in to the righteousness of Christ until Christ returns with his holy angels on the clouds of heaven, friends. It's interesting to me, though, that Joseph Smith was initiated not just by any Grand Master, but one who was clearly Jewish. Not all Grand Masters, I would suspect, are Jewish, but there seemed to be quite a few of them at this time. And at the same time, you read where a lot of communities didn't even want Jews or sort of were prejudiced. So at the same time that people were trying to exclude them, they seemed to be coming over and kind of bypassing all of this and creating their, like they were the authority behind, in many cases, our country. And so we've got to get to the bottom of this. And as I said, the key to this is that they were Sephardic Jews. Now, many of them and most of them probably didn't even know who they were. But when they were initiated into these Masonic orders at that time, they did know. They understood all of this. They knew they were going back to Mary and Jesus. And even in the lodges today, they know it. Some know it. They don't talk about it openly because they're trying to hide that part of it today. But there are still a good number of people in the world, maybe judges or presidents or something, that may have a good heart. But the fact that they're cooperating with this evil system, I mean, it could be straight from Christ himself, but if the whole mob becomes apostate, you need to get out of it. Get out of her, my people, if you don't want to share with her in her sins. And I recommend all judges, lawyers, doctors, and everyone in power or position in this country or in the world step down right now. And let us get on our knees, all of us, all equal before the Lord, and ask for forgiveness. And pray that the Father send his Son Jesus at this time and restore the kingdom. Because if we were to do that, if all the people with all the power, remember when in the first early church, Barnabas was the first one to give all this wealth to the church, at the feet of the church. Barnabas was, it says he owned Cyprus, which is like a country. He had a lot of money. He was certainly a wealthy person because of his royal bloodline. And he gave everything to the church, meaning that at that time there were very wealthy people that felt that the truth was more important than their wealth. We need people like that today. All of you billionaires, right now, lay down your money before the apostles' feet. And if you don't know who the apostles are, they are elders in the community that need to be pointed out. Wise individuals. And how do you know if they're wise? Because they will have wisdom. They will be older, usually, and they will be full of the grace of Christ and the forgiveness and the love of Christ. So, there's a little history of this guy named Abraham Jonas. He didn't know, evidently, why he was doing what he was doing, but he didn't protest Joseph Smith. Like, what are you doing, Joseph? I just initiated you into the Masons. What are you doing over here? What do you got 12 apostles for? They knew what they were doing. They were establishing and restoring truth. And I imagine that even though he was Jewish, when he became a Mason, he learned of their traditions back to Mary and Jesus. So notice this, the J Guide of Europe, France, Occitane, Montpellier. Occitane is the word they use for the language of the Languedoc, the Occitane language. It was the first language that the Bible was translated into from the original Septuagint Greek. Why? Because there was Christians there. We know they were from Mary Magdalene, St. John, and Jesus and his children. And they were there to protect the Holy Textus Receptus. They only had the Septuagint, but that was the first area down there to translate it into the common language of that area, which was Occitane by Montpellier. The traveler Benjamin of Tudela visited Montpellier in 1165. In his travel diaries, he noted the existence of Badi, Midrasha, Kivaut, the Talmud in the city. In addition to these intellectual activities cited in a Hebrew source, Latin documents relate the presence of Jews in trade between Agde, Narbonne, and Montpellier. They had a monopoly on silks and fabrics. Representatives of the Mosaic Law were also involved in the effort to protect the city. Now, this is 1165. So this is a little bit after the expulsion, when they started. Well, it was about the time they were expelling the Waldensians from the area of France and so forth. So they were, this is late in the game. But at this point, there are Judeans there. If you look it up anywhere on AI, I've been asking AI this morning these questions, and their official answer is that these Sephardic Judeans had been in this area in France and Spain for centuries, all the way from about 6 BC. Well, that's interesting. That's about 6 BC would have been about the time that Jesus was born. So John the Baptist and Lazarus and all these individuals would be about from 6 BC. And right around the death of Christ, around 30 AD, or 30 or 40 AD, we don't know exactly when, they started coming. They went into their boat and they took the 72 and they made an established government. And at one point, the capital was Montpellier. Over the centuries, it did change. There was a Toulouse. It was a different capital of it at one point. But originally, it was Montpellier. That was the cultural spot, as well as Marseille, which means Marcy or Mary, because Mary Magdala landed there on the boat with the 72. But it wasn't very far from Montpellier. That became the capital. But by 1165, there were Talmudic Judeans there. Well, why were they still going by the Talmud if they were all Christians down there? And specifically in Montpellier, in the Languedoc area. Well, as I said, AI says they were there before Christ. Some say that even hundreds of years, centuries before Christ, there were Jewish settlers there. They had, remember, Israel had gone and spread all over the world. Literally, this is something people don't understand, is that the 10 tribes were lost and they were all over the world. Some of them went over the Caucasus Mountains, some of them went to Japan, some of them went to India, some of them went to everywhere. And this is where the prophets went to preach to them. And these are the religions, Buddhism and Shintoism and Hinduism and Zoroastrianism and all these isms around the world are the teachings of the prophets. So here in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, there were already Judeans. And in 1165, there were Judeans in Montpellier. But what's interesting is in doing these archaeological digs and and their investigations about the cultures and the peoples of those times, they've dug up a Jewish synagogue from ancient times. And it's basically a mikvah, or a baptismal font. Now, yes, Judeans would baptize. If you were unclean, you had to get baptized. It wasn't something you did, in old Judaism. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to become Jews, we got to get baptized. Well, if you were a Gentile, you had to get baptized because you were unclean. Even if you were an Israelite and you did something that was unclean, you had to get baptized. It was just washing. It was a ceremonial cleansing. But the kind of baptismal, mikvah that they had there appears that this form of Judaism here in Montpelier had more to do with Christianity in some way. There were certainly similarities to the baptism of the Christians. But why were these people there? Because they were already there. The Lord had already placed Israelites all around the world. So when Mary Magdalene and her daughter Sarah and her son Joseph and Lazarus and the 72 established, it doesn't explain all the ins and outs of how they took the 72 and made a Sanhedrin, but it must have took some time. And how would these people that were already there, which were Sephardic Judeans that lived in the area, and later on Islamic peoples, because they became Islamic believers and fought the Europeans up to the Spain-France border, and for up until 1492 they had all of Spain, and an alliance with the Languedoc, which was always a thorn in the side of the Holy Roman Empire. That Languedoc up in France holding on to the alliance with the Spanish Islamic peoples. But the peoples down there were peace loving, and the Judeans and the Islamic peoples and the Christians all got together. Now, how come? Because they weren't the same kind of Christians. First of all, they considered themselves, these Christians, descendants of Jews, which was Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and Lazarus and these 72 elders, many of them which were, certainly they were all, from that culture, and they came from Jerusalem and were brought there. So they were like James and Peter and John. They had been Jews, but they were Christians. So when they got there, they said, hey, yeah, we're Christians. But of course, they knew about Jesus. And when they first got there, they were in France, but they heard about Jesus, how he died, and they knew what it was all about. And many of them were becoming Christians. But there were Jewish people that didn't become Christians. They continued to be Jews. But the Christians there considered them their brethren because they were all related. And they kind of started blending a mix of Christianity and Judaism. Although there was the knights that remained absolutely sound in their Christian beliefs, knowing, having these certain truths that they held dear and that they explained to those who were initiated. So they probably explained to the Jewish people there, look, you got to become Christian, you got to know about the love of Christ, but you're our brothers. And then it was in that area too that the Kabbalah began to be spoken of, and many famous rabbis came from there who wondered and philosophized about the Torah and started thinking about Greek philosophy as well. So it was kind of a mix of Christians, Jews, and Islamic peoples because of the tolerance of the people of Mary Magdalene and her descendants. So the Jews in trade between Agde, Narbonne, and Montpelier. So there's a picture of one of these medieval mikveh of Montpelier. You can see the steps where they go down into the water. Looks very much like a Christian baptism. The current Rue de la Barrière is the old central street of the Jewish quarter in the seigneurial stronghold of the Guilhelm. The The religious complex includes a place called synagogue, a house of alms, a house of studies, and the medieval mikveh, which has been found and restored. All components of the Schola Judaeum, it can be visited at north 1 degree on the street. We can see the 12th century bath having escaped the roughness of the time, the undressing room, as well as the basin with the 7 underwater steps. Interesting that there's 7 steps. This is certainly not pure Judaism. And its wall orifice decorated with a gargoyle. Now we're talking about like a temple, and the gargoyles would be the astrological symbols on the temple that is guarding you, or holy symbols of the angels, meaning cherubim with the 4 faces, or these animals like the Sphinx guarding the Great Pyramid and so forth. And the first 2 deepest are from medieval times, a jewel of Romanesque art made by Christian architects at the request of the Jewish community. So the Jews in the community was using Christian architecture. So I don't know if they were just preserving the old Jewish synagogue but had a lot of Christian beliefs, or what's going on here. But, well, and in a sense, you look at the Kabbalah, which is from that Jewish era, and they were certainly not just talking about Torah in a literal sense by, oh, it's the law, we got to keep the law. But they were looking at it as an esoteric book. And so they were indeed understanding that they as a people were following an esoteric teaching about the true deity. And I'm sure many of these Judeans believed in Jesus, but they were still Jews. Visible with the Montpelier tourist office, this hotspot of Montpelier's memory is part of an exceptional medieval synagogue ensemble, which has been the subject of an in-depth archaeological excavations carried out by Christian Markiewicz, associate member of the LA3M Laboratory of the Medieval Modern Archaeology in Mediterranean, and the city of Montpelier. Anyway, a lot of words, I don't want to go through all that. But it says, which led to the recent update of additional basins, pavements, and spaces adjoining the 12th century Jewish ritual bath. A Jewish quarter open to mixed Judeo-Christian habitat. So it's mixed Judeo-Christian habitat developed in the 13th century. So the Jews in Montpelier and the Languedoc. The 14th century was the century of the expulsion of the Jews from France, marked by dismissals. The Jews settled during the last authorized period. Montpelier will have been the scene of famous Maimonidean controversies. Maimonides, a great rabbi. A first time in 1230 around the writings of Rambam, a copy of the Guide of the Perplexed would have been, according to Hillel of Verona, destroyed in public place a second time around the 1300s against philosophy, Athens, and Jerusalem. Should we understand the Mosaic law in the light of the Greek Sophia? A Phidias reading, or a reading supported by reason. Intellectual excitement, in any case, is not fortuitous that this takes place in Montpelier, a place of intellectual and theological profusion, and within the Jewish world. So yeah, they are Jews, they identify as Jews, and others of the lineal descent of Mary in France and the Languedoc considered themselves Cathars or Christians, but knew about their Jewish ancestry. But people converted because they believed that all the children of the world were lost Israel. And it was only this royal bloodline from Mary Magdalene that was spoken of in the poems and the legends about the future purpose for this seed of Christ to be mingled into the world through this great miracle. And the teachings and the knights that were preserving the holy blood and the holy scriptures, and the idea of the princess who would eventually find the prince and pull out the sword of truth and defeat the great dragon, and the prince and the princess would get married and live happily ever after. This was their stated purpose. And they were building a heaven on earth, as it shows in the stories at Avalon, and later on, some descendants of these individuals, Jews and Christians, because these Sephardic Jews had already been steeped in all of this understanding about the esoteric. And so when they came to America, both individuals were members of the Knights of St. John or Europeans, whoever they may have been. The Basque were mostly, I believe the Basque is where all of the Rh negative bloodline seems to be stemming from, this Basque region, which is all of these individuals, Sephardic Judeans, that seem to be right in the middle of this area around the Languedoc. Would it be far-fetched to think that Jesus' blood would be a little maybe different because he was Jesus and was the Holy Son of God? And perhaps then the book of Hosea, when it says that he will plant them like seed at some point, it's a prophecy, and they'll grow up all over the world, and then one day there'll be a big harvest. You see, all the prophecies and the parables of Jesus fit together. It's all talking about this manor, like a vineyard or a field or an orchard. But in this little paradise field or whatever that represents this world, the kingdom of Christ, Jesus is in control. And he's got stewards, and they plant and they harvest and they grow and they learn, and they're trying to keep the kingdom going as the home of mankind. But there are some evil stewards that come in and do some shenanigans. And when Jesus returns, he's going to give everyone a reward. But I, for one, believe that Jesus lived and died on that cross and married Mary Magdalene, and Mary and the 72 went to Marseille, France, named after Marseille or Mary, and the Knights of St. John, which history proves and establishes that came from that area where they built that amazing monastery, and in that prestigious esoteric group that continued to hand down these mysteries until Saint Bernard of Clairvaux built that temple in Spain, and somehow or another it was brought over here to America. And these fools here in America think they're still pursuing the goal, but they're no longer pursuing the prize. They're just digging for the gold, and that's all they care about. They're now worshiping the gold. And Joseph Smith came and told them, and they didn't listen. And Peter Waldo came and told them, they didn't listen. And Luther came and told them, they didn't listen. And a lot of people came and told them. Helena Blavatsky came and told them, and they didn't listen. Mary Baker Eddy came and told them, and they didn't listen. And many others. But we continue to tell them. And regardless of whether the world is won over and all the evil is gone, we're winning hearts and souls. We're the light of the world. We got to let our light shine. We're the salt of the earth. And we need to preserve ourselves and our truths and our teachings. And we need to love one another and preach Christ and wait patiently for his coming. But we've got to save as many souls and love as many people while we're here. Not only for our education, because it's what we want, because we love our brethren, and it is the true way of life, but because we can help the world and we can live in peace if we establish these truths. So we need to teach our brethren and show them love. And maybe we can snatch some of these that are going into the fire, out of the fire, the Bible says. We got to snatch them out before it's too late. Jesus comes, there's going to be a judgment. It don't matter if half the world or more is in apostasy. Jesus knows those that love him, and those who don't are just confused. And so anyway, I'm going to probably just leave it there. I apologize that I went so far over an hour. I know it's a long video, an hour, almost an hour and a half now. But, I just got to put this information down and sit down and however long it takes me to get my point out, I guess. I'm trying to do about an hour. And, some of you will feel as though it's important to watch these. Those who find these videos helpful, others will. And some of you won't have enough time. You're working, you got things to do. I get that. But if any of you are really interested in understanding what's going on, follow me here, watch these videos, try to listen to all of them if you can, because we're getting to the bottom of some very amazing things, friends. Anyway, going to let you go. Hope you have a wonderful evening. May his grace and his peace be with you all, and he will answer all of your prayers. Seek him, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Blessings to all. Have a good one.